Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. There's a short message on the screen. While we wait, what do you hope to get out of the session? Feel free to put some thought into this question and drop your responses into the chat box. This question could be helpful for our panelists as we get into the panel presentation and the Q&A there. So what do you hope to get out of this session? We are here today to talk about the essential leadership competencies of an effective D&I practitioner. Today, we will focus on leading. This is basically one of a series of workshops. So we are on workshop 4 of 5. Thank you to everyone who has registered for the previous 3 sessions and also to all of you who have registered for the 5th session as well. We appreciate your attendance, your participation, and your engagement. The workshop objectives are listed here. So pretty much we want to support the professional development of D&I practitioners. We want to facilitate meaningful discussions, amplify the voices of D&I leaders in the region, and then create a space for networking so we can all listen, learn, and grow together. Time is reserved during this workshop for Q&A after the panel. If you have questions throughout the workshop, please feel free to drop those into the chat box. I'm not exactly sure how many people will actually show up for the live viewing of this, but we did have 85 people registered for the session. So I just want to ensure that everyone has a chance to share their questions via chat. If you don't want to share publicly, that's fine too. Feel free to send me a private message and then I will raise it to our panelists whenever the time is appropriate or address it myself if it's something that I can answer. So opening remarks, we always start out with a welcome, objectives and logistics. Check that off the box. We got that covered. Next, we're going to do a quick guidebook overview. That will be followed by a panel presentation with some time for Q&A. We'll wrap up the meeting by doing small group discussions, and then I'll share some next steps before we dismiss. All of these workshops are using the framework of the D&I Five Essential Leadership Competencies of an Effective D&I Practitioner Guidebook. So this resource was published in January of this year, and the whole goal is to document the essential competencies, roles, and responsibilities of a D&I practitioner. If you've attended these workshops before, I normally provide a bunch of background information about how it can be used and things like that, but I know that there are a lot of repeat attendees, which I greatly appreciate. So I'll skip over that portion today. But it is important to acknowledge the contributing authors in that guidebook. So in addition to using some national research, I also had the privilege of interviewing 15 different D&I practitioners from right here in West Michigan, and they represent various companies, different industry sectors, different company sizes, and then also dimensions of diversity. Representation is really important when you talk about diversity and inclusion or leading in this space. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank my contributing authors. We have the privilege of having 3 of those authors here today for our panel, which we'll get to very soon. If you opened up a copy of the D&I guidebook, you would know that it was based on 5 competencies. So personal characteristics, knowledge, planning, leading, and communication. That's the model or the framework that we use. And leading is really the ability to influence people and systems to keep the work moving forward. In the guidebook, there is a section where we talk a lot about the role of the CEO and the infrastructure of the company to set up a D&I leader or practitioner for success in this space. So before we get things started today, I also just want to acknowledge that D&I is very different than other change management in the sense that you have to think about or consider and kind of tailor your approach to include some of these bullet points that I have listed here. So diversity, equity, inclusion, all of those are very sensitive topics that can make people uncomfortable or even defensive. The work revolves a lot of self-reflection and self-awareness, so both on an individual level and company level, because it often requires changing attitudes, behaviors, and sometimes even individual beliefs. The work is very personal, relationship-based, and at times emotional. Understanding that D&I is important is related to both the business case and the moral case. Everyone deserves a voice in the conversation and in your organization, so you'll have to engage people at various levels. The work is never finished, so that's why we'll often refer to DEI or D&I as a journey, because some programs may have a start date and an end date, but the work is never done, especially when you talk about developing your culture or just, improving outcomes, things like that. So companies are also often afraid to engage in this work because they don't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and there's always criticism. So, sometimes people say you're not doing enough, or you're not moving fast enough, or you're not getting the outcomes that we want. So there's a little bit of a risk aversion to doing this work. But then also the field is always evolving. So new terminology, new training, certification programs, advocacy groups, things like that. So in this space, sometimes people tiptoe or walk on eggshells because they don't want to say the wrong thing and they don't want to offend someone. So that could also prevent someone from doing this work or, really taking it seriously. But just some things to think about as we go into the conversation of leading D&I. I always like to start things out with a poll question. We like to know who's in the room, know what some of your challenges are, and then just also get some crowd participation. So today, I changed up the poll question. If you're a returning attendee, this question is very different than anything we've asked in the past. But I want to know, what is your greatest challenge leading diversity and inclusion? So I'm going to launch the poll now and share the possible options with you. So option 1, limited experience and or subject matter expertise. Option 2, D&I goals and strategies have not been established or are not clear. Number 3, lack of resources, either personnel or financial. Number 4, lack of positional authority. Number 5, lack of support from the CEO, executives, or even just regular colleagues. Or there could also be a lack of shared accountability where your organization may think, D&I is responsibility of one person or one department. So that lack of shared accountability. And then the last option here is unrealistic company expectations. So I want to give everyone a moment to participate in this poll. The poll could also help inform some of the comments that our panelists make later. So I want to make sure that everyone has the time to put some thought into this and then submit an answer if you desire. We've had about 19 responses so far. 70% of the attendees have voted. I do want to give you all a chance to continue to vote. The survey is anonymous. I don't know who said what, so I won't be emailing you or following up with you afterwards or doing any more digging in your companies. But what is your greatest challenge leading D&I? There are 6 of you on the call who haven't participated yet. Just want to give you a moment if you'd like to provide an answer. Part of D&I is shared accountability, so holding you accountable to submit your vote. All right, 23 people have voted so far. So I'm going to end the polling and share the results. Okay, so you should be able to see the poll results on your screen now. The response that received the greatest amount of answers is limited experience and or subject matter expertise. So 48% said that. And then let's see, the next highest looks like at 22%, lack of support from CEO, executives, or colleagues, or shared accountability. That was the second most popular answer. And then the third response is really tied at 17%, lack of resources and lack of positional authority. All right, so thank you all for participating in the poll. Even if you didn't answer that poll question, I hope that you were able to think about some of the challenges so that can help you decide what your next step should be as a leader in this space. I'm going to stop sharing my results now, and we'll just move right along with our agenda. Up there's my sensitive mouse. If you participated before, you've seen my screen just kind of go crazy from time to time, but okay. So now we are going to get into the guidebook content. At the beginning of each competency section, we always start with a definition. We like to let you all know exactly what we were thinking about when we created the competency statements and the examples of how you would utilize that competency in the workplace. So when we talk about leading, we are talking about how leading organizational change requires both business acumen and political savvy to navigate your organization and communicate data to compel people to act. So it involves the ability to influence, to shift mindsets, solve problems, and then also disrupt programs, practices, and systems in order to move that organization forward. So that just kind of helps frame what we mean when we say leading within your organization. In the guidebook on page 44, you will also notice a set of D&I competency statements. So an effective D&I leader should be able to secure CEO level support for D&I, but this does not solely fall on the weight of the D&I practitioner or leader. So there's some additional text there. But number 2, negotiate the needed level of autonomy to make change. Number 3, gain fellowship throughout various levels of the organization. So beyond positional authority, based on your passion, competence, and credibility. Number 4, consult and cooperate with various internal stakeholders to execute your strategic plan. And then number 5, collaborate with community partners for sourcing, engagement, and other philanthropy opportunities. I'm not going to get into the details of the application because we have a really great group of panelists who will cover a lot of these remarks in their time to share. So once again, this is on page 44 of your guidebook if you want to take a closer look at this. And if there are no questions, I will actually stop talking and then turn things over to our panelists. We have a really great group of panelists today. We have Dr. Brandy Lovelady Mitchell, who is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Kent Intermediate School District. We have a familiar face, Joe Matthews, who was actually kind of kicking things off with us back in March. He was one of our very first panelists for this session. So he is the Vice President of Purchasing and the Diversity Officer for Gentex Corporation. And then we also have Courtney Simmons, who's the Manager for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Herman Miller. So Courtney's also a newer face to this group, but definitely a value add, just like Brandy and Joe. So I am going to stop sharing my screen so that we can focus on the speakers. And then we are just going to start with introductions. I always ask our panelists to share a little bit about yourself. So I give them the freedom to share, your experience in D&I, why you're passionate about this work, a little bit about your story or your experience, just whatever you'd like our attendees to know today as it relates to you and your kind of journey or leadership position in the D&I space. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Brandy Lovelady Mitchell to start things off.
Thank you, Whitney. And I appreciate you inviting people into this space to unpack such a critical and relevant topic. And so I'll go back to the question. I was about to digress already. I will stay to the script. But I think my journey in terms of working on DEI issues actually stems way back from when I was a student in schools. And for whatever reason, I just always had a heart for, advocacy around justice-related issues. And then certainly as an educator, a building leader principal, felt that it was my calling and duty to braid the red thread of equity and inclusion in everything that I was doing on behalf of students and the adults who walked the spaces that I was leading. And so more recently was given the opportunity to be the founding director of diversity, equity, and inclusion for Kent ISD. And what that means is servicing 20 public school districts and 23 charter schools in the region of Kent County and beyond, related to helping educators and those folks affiliated design equitable and inclusive P through 12 learning systems, and hopefully that will yield more equitable educational outcomes. It also has meant coordinating professional learning opportunities to help people build muscle around equity and inclusion issues in particular, advocating and serving in many ways as a coach as people grapple with this individually and systemically. So that is the work that I'm doing right now. That's a little bit about me. And so I will pass it on to Courtney.
Thanks, Brandy, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel. I think you'll probably get a lot of comments related to equity, because I know certainly that that's a point of focus for me, and you heard that from Brandy, and I imagine you'll hear it from Joe as well. But I'll share that I at Herman Miller have the pleasure of working at the intersection, I say, of diversity, equity, and inclusion and talent management. And so I work really closely with the people that lead that work within our organization. So thinking about learning, talent acquisition, supporting employees and their development is all really key to my work, with a particular focus on learning to ensure that we're creating an organization that enables a diverse talent population to thrive. And Whitney did ask us to talk about what led us to this work. And so I'll focus a little bit on how this became passion work for me, and share that in college I studied psychology, and in particular I did a study abroad and studied the psychology of social inequality in a class. And I've since been very interested in justice and equity work. And then when I started working professionally in a corporation, not Herman Miller, I experienced what it was like to be an outlier or an other across many of my most salient identities in a corporate space. And I learned really quickly the ways in which organizations both intentionally and unintentionally tell people how they fit or don't fit, and the ways that we learn as a result to cover the most important and differentiating aspects of ourselves. And so it was then that I became really passionate about bringing that work into corporate spaces and creating workplaces and spaces that enable individuals to thrive as their complete, authentic selves. There was a point in that career that I was leading D&I, but I was hiding still elements of myself. So I started there as a volunteer, and I'm grateful for the privilege and challenge of being able to practice this work every day and pushing us beyond the bounds of what corporate D&I has been. And Joe, over to you, please.
Sorry, I was going to speak, but for those who don't know me, and this could be redundant for some people, again, kind of my experience really kind of transcends when I left high school. So I grew up in Gary, Indiana. Gary's predominantly Black. I went to Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. Rose-Hulman, when I went to school, it's based in Terre Haute, Indiana, and it was all male school at the time, and it was predominantly white American males. So in fact, I was the only Black guy in my class. There was no sophomores, 3 juniors and 2 seniors. And once I graduated from Rose-Hulman, my wife and I went to go live in Japan. So in a period of 5 years, I went to 3 different cultures: a Black American culture, a white male American culture, and a Japanese culture. And really, those experiences are foundational to how I go about looking at work I've done either in the manufacturing operations arena, graduate school, to being in purchasing now in terms of management for the last 20 years. The last 3, or you got to say the last 4 years, I've been in its diversity officer for Gentex. The thing that's really triggered for me is that it started my own personal journey, understanding more about the history that I didn't know. One of the tidbits I'd like to share is that when my dad did a lot of nonprofit work, and that turns out one of his mentors is somebody by the name of Dr. Reverend Leon H. Sullivan. You could probably look up Dr. Sullivan. He actually established the Sullivan Principles that focus on apartheid in South Africa. In fact, I believe Dr. Sullivan is one of the first Black board members on General Motors General Motors board of directors in the late 60s, early 70s. In addition, what's pretty unique about Dr. Sullivan is that he's one of the ones that espoused supplier diversity as well. And so that's one of the history points I did not know. And it just kind of triggers a whole wealth of information when you really reflect back. And this goes back to kind of the first competency we talked about, personal characteristics, where you really had to understand as you lead organizations, what is your foundation upon which you want to lead? In terms of the company at Gentex, for me, it's 4 years into the journey. I actually got to roll unofficially as diversity officer in July 2018. It was officially announced in December 2018. And you can say right now, if you start 2018 as the first year, I'm 4 years into the journey for Gentex as a company in terms of our transformation from a DEI perspective.
Thank you all for providing those introductions and opening remarks. For all of our attendees, I hope you feel a little bit more connected to our panelists after hearing how they got started or a little bit about their history and what brought them here. So hopping right into our panel questions. Based on the leading competency statements on page 44 of the guidebook, which resonated the most with you? And then can you also provide an example of how that competency is used in the workplace? Joe, I'd like to start this with you.
I'm glad Whitney's following the script because I am an introvert and a planner, and if she were to change the order, I would be totally discombobulated. So thank you, Whitney, for following the pre-script that she sent to us. I don't know if anybody can relate to that because my notes are here, and if my notes fell off my table, you will see me start scrambling. But really, for me, I thought there's actually 2 of the competencies that resonate with me, but I'll just speak to one of them. And again, that's kind of the first, I think it's the second one. Let me get my notes in front of me. They're here. 3, gain followership throughout various levels of the organization beyond positional authority based on passion, competence, and credibility. Again, for me, that's really important for us as a company. And kind of give you the history how I got the diversity officer role. Steve Downing, Gentex's CEO, was our CFO before for the previous 4 years. And I believe really what he wanted to do is establish a different trajectory for us as a company in his first year of tenure, in particular the first 6 months of tenure. He approached me pretty much in May of 2018 saying, Joe, here's an idea I have. You know, I know you're very passionate about making sure you get unleashed at potential people. And I think you would do really well in this role. I mean, it is an add-on because again, my primary responsibility is VP of purchasing. And for those who are in the supply chain community, you know, this is a very challenging time, particularly if you have different types of buys. But also, I'm able to use a little bit more of the things I bring to the table in terms of all the attributes I have as well. And so I embrace that role because again, for me, it's not only professional, but it's also personal, as I explained earlier. And so one of the things I think I like to highlight on is talks about move at the pace that is appropriate for the organization. One of the things I'm very, and this is actually comes from some of the contributors to the guidebook. I remember having a session with Dr. Rayanne Booker when she was at Davenport University. And Rayanne said, Joe, make sure you use the data, make sure everybody sees themselves in the data. The other thing you get to realize is that as people see themselves in the data, you get to go at a pace where everybody can digest it. And that's something I got directly from one of the contributors to the guidebook. And I've really firmly embraced that because again, as we as a company, we're trying to make sure that everybody starts the journey. Not everybody's gonna, I don't say everybody's gonna go to the journey willingly, but what I mean by that is that people are gonna go at their own pace. Some people are gonna be very, let's say, embrace a lot of different things more progressively. Some people are gonna be a little bit slower. And so one of the things we end up doing this year, finally for us, and this is probably about 2 years in the process, we actually launched Franklin Covey Unconscious Bias Workshop across all the leadership group. I actually attended a session back in July 2019. We had a pilot in March of 2020 with the DI council members, as well as some of our personnel from the HR group. And one of the things that we ended up doing is that in November 2020, we put this as one of our major initiatives for 2021. And I'm happy to say that in terms of our VP staff, our executive team, our middle management, as well as some of our lead managers, we've embraced that workshop. And now we're going to go to phase 2 of that workshop in starting in Q3, which is basically all hiring authorities inside the company. So I'm really excited about that because it opens up a discussion. In fact, you know, one of the comments was that some people thought that this is going to be a guilt session, but they realized that no, this is just fundamental to who people are. Biases are not good and bad by themselves, but depends on what you do with how you impact it, how you react to that bias. And that's a key message that we want to deliver to the organization. The other thing that we also have is business resource groups. At this point, we only have 2, and that is women at Gentex, and we have women Gentex vets. And even there, because that's such a highly employee driven, we're going to continue to add more business resource groups that are either identity-based or experience-based or some intersectionality of the two. But we're going at the pace where the employees are supported. I think I'm going to talk to another competency as well, because I'm pretty excited about something just happened yesterday for us. We also collaborate with community partners for sourcing engagement and philanthropy opportunities. The thing I think I'm pretty excited about D&I work is that it's really allows you to be a community entrepreneur. And what I mean by that is that you match up the company's passion for DI with what exists in the community. So for us as a company, about 40% of the people who work inside of Gentex, inside the Holland Zeeland area, have a Holland area zip code. So we actually partner with Holland Public Schools. We do things at the district-wide level, as well as the high school level, middle school level, and elementary school level, in particular with Jefferson Elementary. And yesterday, I believe it's the first that's happened inside the district since the pandemic, we had a Jefferson Elementary STEM night. And it was a resounding success. We have over 112 students, not including the parental figures, so over about 200 people attending. We had some of our chemists inside of Gentex had chemistry tables set up. And we also have Ozobots. For those familiar, Ozobots is really a great introduction to robotics. I guess the other skill set I have is I now can teach robotics to at least to elementary school children. And it was a resounding success. And everybody now is like, okay, can we get these Ozobots in our classrooms coming in the fall? And we'll work on that as a company with probably other community partners here inside of in Holland Zeeland, in particular Holland area. That's just one example of what can happen if you leverage the community partnerships that exist. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can add, but again, I think the other part too is building relationships with universities, as well as looking at other, let's say, talent acquisition tools that exist so you can expand your reach from a workforce perspective. So those are kind of the 2 competencies that really resonate with me outside of the leading competency group in terms of subcomponents.
Thank you, Joe. I'll invite Courtney or Dr. Brandy Lovelady Mitchell to share any additional responses related to that first question of, based on the competency statements, which one resonated the most with you? Why? And could you provide an example for the workplace? Three-part question. It's a compound question. But Courtney or Dr. Lovelady, would you like to go next?
Sorry, I had to learn how to use my mute button. I'm happy to add. I'll say it's interesting that you picked a couple of competencies, Joe, because I similarly had a hard time picking. It's kind of like picking your favorite kid, right? Like you have a relationship with each of them, and those relationships are different. They're all important to you. And so I picked four, which I'm sure won't surprise you, but I'll just comment on a part of what you said, Joe, in that notion behind pace that we talk about in the guidebook, moving at a pace that's appropriate for the organization. And what really resonates with me there is that it's not necessarily the pace for the slowest person or the most resistant person, right? That like there are going to be people that you have to push along. And a couple of concepts that resonate with for me are from a past leader who talked about how you can push without being pushy and you can disagree without being disagreeable. And I continue to carry those with me because I think that one really important role for people that lead at our level and in our organizations is to help the business see where there might be blind spots, to challenge them in a loving and respectful way that pushes us along and acknowledges the pace that the business is willing to go. I think that I can acknowledge that I tend to be relatively impatient and I often have to be reminded to slow down, but I think that we do have a role in helping the business to move along, but yes, meeting people where they are. As for my chosen competency, I picked number 4, consult and cooperate with various internal stakeholders to execute the strategic plan. And I'd add to that it's both develop and execute. So again, it'll probably be a surprise to no one since I talked about my adjacency to talent management, but where it talks specifically within the competency about building relationships in human resources and talent development, I think that has been really key and really important to the work progress that we've had. When I started at Herman Miller, the relationship between DEI and talent management was non-existent, or or it wasn't good. At best, it was non-existent, and beyond that, it wasn't good because there was a conversation around we need to be better, right? We need to be better at diversity and inclusion, and that means our recruiters need to do a better job finding us talent. Of course, I'll hire diverse talent. Just bring it to me. There's so many problems with that statement, but those were the kinds of conversations that were happening, and so I spent a lot of time building relationships and applying the lessons of competency 3 to understanding the challenges that were happening for our recruiters, helping them to develop their cultural intelligence so that they could have relationships with their hiring managers and influence the conversation. I also was sitting right at the table in talent management leadership decisions so that I could influence the way that we were deliberately centering or not centering diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a small example of where I had an early success that I'm still really proud of was shifting our organization from having a pretty hand selection base, especially for development opportunities that were differently or less formal, right? There's an opportunity for someone to be sponsored to get their executive MBA. There's an opportunity for someone to go to this event. Those types of things, that glamour work and glamour opportunities, were really hand selected. Do you know someone who'd be interested in this? And when knowledge is held by the few, by the in-group, it is inherently inequitable. And so I challenged our organization to move from hand selection and do you know somebody who might, to identifying a process, identifying the key criteria for those opportunities, and then allowing people to understand, broadly communicating, here's an opportunity, here's what we're looking for, and allowing people to opt in or self-select out of the opportunity, and then picking based on that established criteria, which made it more equitable, more accessible, and more representative of our population. Thanks.
That was great. Thank you. Dr. Brandy Lovelady Mitchell, would you like to share anything related to this question?
No, I think they knocked it out of the park. I would concur with everything that they said. And I think my future responses will just continue to underscore the competency. So thank you.
All right, well, I am going to direct my next question to you then. How do you create shared accountability when leading DEI work? I know that sometimes an organization will hire a chief diversity officer or will give this responsibility to someone in HR or organizational development. And there's a lot of weight and pressure put on that person's shoulder to implement, create these strategies, implement, and then also, show some outcomes. Sometimes people want these outcomes in 6 months. Sometimes they want them in a year, but that's not realistic always. So how do organizations create shared accountability when doing this work?
Thank you for that question. I think it's one of the toughest questions that D&I professionals wrestle with. And so my brain is a little full. So I'm going to for a second. And then if you all need me to clarify or expound, I certainly will. But even when Courtney and Joe were talking, it made me think about a story that I heard the late great Ruth Jones talking about, and she was a principal at the K-5 level. And some of you have heard me tell the story before because I think it's just profound and our GPS in many ways. And forgive me for the religious speak, but the quote went something like, wouldn't it be just like God to have created the cure to cancer and planted it in the brain in one of those babies, our scholars who falls through the crack? Isn't that story the epitome of equity and inclusion? And I don't think that she was trying to speak in a blasphemous way, but it speaks to the heartbeat of why equity and inclusion work is so important. And to me, it speaks to accountability in terms of whatever sphere of influence we have, it is everyone's work to ensure that there are either ultimately no cracks and or a safety net to ensure that no one is falling through, and or that each of us have a ladder that are sticking it in that crack to pull people out and addressing the systems that prevent other people, more people from falling in. So for me, when we talk about accountability, it is each of us centering the end users and then taking a step back and being able to say, so what is my part in this? And so the job of a DEI officer is helping people see their sphere of influence or their part in that story of creating justice or equitable systems. It also is in being clear about your data. And if your data, if your goal and mission of existing is to build bridges so no one falls through the cracks, how are we doing with that? And again, working backwards to ensure the front desk person, the cafeteria person, the person answering the phone, the person in the office, the person presenting are all in alignment and working towards the end goal of serving the end user. So our data invites people in to the equity, inclusion, justice work. I think the other thing though, as we talk about accountability is simply, I'm going to say simply, but this is not simple, because if it was, we wouldn't be in our current situation nationally and locally. It is building the muscle and the competency of your CEO, your superintendent, your chief, whoever that person is, in terms of them explicating, publishing their why. Like, why do you even have an E&I division or person? Because when that person speaks, they set the tone and thereby help people know that this is not a flavor of the month, and that each of us are going to be held accountable to this. And then you have that person also talking about how he or she is accountable to it and being vulnerable related to how they're learning and deepening their muscle and their competencies around that. And you hope fractal scaling happens. And then if you're a great leader, you do more than hope, but in your evaluations and your goals and in your collective learning, you are benchmarking how that's happening. And so, for us, it has also meant, and I'm not saying that we have arrived, but this is the work that we're doing, and it's messy, hard, sweaty, sometimes bloody work, and it's imperfect work. But in terms of the accountability, it has also meant when we launch our new strategic plan, equity and inclusion is braided right in there. So it's not siloed out as Brandy's work, because the moment it becomes Brandy's work and only Brandy's accountable for it, it will die. So the strategic plan helps cast the net wide in terms of everyone seeing themselves in it and inviting everyone into the work and everyone being held accountable for it. It means board members are wrestling with a goal around equity and inclusion. It means that your senior leadership team are wrestling with goals and data about how you're doing with that goal, and benchmarking in that way. The other big piece for accountability for us is just survey. Like if I surveyed people on this call and said, what is your equity vision? Like what's the vision? Like if you were doing work well, where would you be? A lot of people would have a lot of different answers. So then it looks like this. And then you say, have I arrived? And everybody's like, yeah. And the end users are like, no. So clarity around your equity vision also brings some accountability. And then you're always asking everyone at every tier of the organization, what is your work related to this equity vision? How are we doing with it and mapping out? If our equity vision is this, again, at every level of the organization, this is what needs to happen to produce this North Star, our equity vision. So you're everybody's braiding equity and inclusion into everything and being very explicit about it. There are checkpoints. And then I guess the last thing that I'll say is one of the things that has been most important for me in terms of helping to spread accountability is understanding that balance of it's accountability with support. So while we are accountable to the end users and there's some urgency around it, and I wish we were working at the pace of our end users, and in my case, that's our scholars, P through 12, they set the pace because they are the ones that are being harmed or healed by what we do. And at the same time, understanding that while I'm holding people accountable, I'm building support, hence the reason why I coordinate professional learning. I'm also building champions. So when there are inequities, which seem like they're glaring and on fire and in my face, others who did not see it previously, I'm helping them to build a lens so they can start to see, so they can start to notice and start to be empathetic and care and show up, which helps make the ground fertile for accountability and for people showing up differently and people interacting with folks differently. So that's my long answer. And I do think it's a hard one, but to me, that's the work. That is the work right there. And I'm like a Baptist preacher I'm almost done, for real, this is my last thing. And I can't stress enough that 2021, and as we think about 2022, is inviting us to calibrate on the healing and harm of our end users. We cannot calibrate our work on who's comfortable and who's not. I mean, because we have to ask ourselves, who are we centering and why? Too much in schools in particular has been not about student needs, but about adult convenience. So end users.
That was a lot for us to unpack. I have a lot of notes on what you just shared. Thank you, Dr. Brandy Lovelady Mitchell. Joe, Courtney, do you want to add on to anything that she has shared? Do you have any thoughts around how to create that shared accountability? Anything additional to add?
Nothing for me.
Joe.
I feel like the answer was so good and so complete, I hesitate to offer anything. Recognizing that some of you said that you struggle with, I think many of you responded, I wrote it down and lost my note. Many of you responded that there's a lack of familiarity, my term, not Whitney's, lack of experience and subject matter expertise. And so what I'll say is, even as a practitioner that's been doing this work for multiple years, like I want to be like, Dr. Brandy Lovelady Mitchell, could we have 2 hours to unpack what you just shared? Because I want to talk more about all the things. And so having said that, I'll just offer maybe something that feels uber to what is the word I'm looking for? Simple, because it is not simple. And actually the reality is when this question came up, I was like, I don't want to go first. We're like, will you do it, Brandy? So here we are. But what I'll say is that for us at Herman Miller, we had to take a step back. We've been doing DEI for a really long time. And in the last year, just like everyone, to Brandy's point, we need to recalibrate. We're doing a lot of that work. And so we've reintroduced new metrics. She talked a lot about data, and that has been really important to us, is to create some decisions about where we want to be. It's imperfect and it is a journey, and we have a lot more yet to do, but we've created an expectation of what we want our metrics to be and who does have accountability in them. And we've involved our chief for sure and her leadership team. So all of her direct reports, and we're having regular meetings on a quarterly basis to review that data, to talk about what's showing up in the data, to talk about the conditions that are creating that experience, right? Because the data is what it is, but it gets there because of decisions we do and don't make. And so what's leading to this environment, and then what are the necessary interventions? And so not only do we have data and we're talking about it and we have responsibility for them to show up for it, but then we're following that up with action, and we're creating events and opportunities for them to do exactly what Brandy said: lead with vulnerability, to demonstrate that this is messy and imperfect, that they don't have it figured out, but that it's important for us to engage in dialogue, for us to demonstrate where we have successes and opportunities to be better to the business. And so we've had some great success in pulling in more leaders than the expected ones, the DEI leaders, the chief, and the talent management leaders.
Joe, would you like to add anything before I move on to the next question?
No, I'm good. I'm preparing for my next question, Whitney. You know, I'm again, I got my plan. I'm going to tie on some of the things that Dr. Brandy talked about, as well as Courtney, and how I answered her next question.
All right, I don't mean to throw Joe off, but I do have a question from the audience. So I did have a question that came in that asked how to lead when there are competing or conflicting values among the executive leadership team. So we've been talking about shared accountability. We've been talking about engaging multiple stakeholders. We've been talking about embedding D&I into the strategic plan. But how does someone lead when there are competing or conflicting values amongst that leadership team? So this is a curveball. If you need to tell me,
I'll answer from a business perspective, at least for us. So again, you know, we have competing priorities all the time. I mean, we have customers that want their product. I mean, but with that being said, it's not this and not this or that, is this and that. This is important to our employees, it's important to our community, it's important to our marketplace. And so we have to figure out, that's what leadership does. They figure out how to be able to handle the ambiguity in terms of having multiple priorities that tie on the time, intentional resources. So you have to make the space. Sometimes it's not what maybe the DI leader expects, but they're still making the space to do it. For instance, you know, one of the things that I think about for us is, okay, we postponed a lot of things for 2020 because of the pandemic into 2021. So I talked directly to the CEO, okay, what type of budget should I plan for 2021? I had a discussion in October of 2020. Steve, do you want to do this or do you want to do this? And he said, Joe, I want to do this. Okay, and this you prioritize directly with at least from my particular situation, the diversity officer reports directly to the CEO of the company. HR usually has a lot of the functions inside of what happens from a D&I perspective, so I partnered with that person. But really, I drove the agenda in terms of what the budget would be for 2021. That helps set the priorities with him. And then at that point, it's a matter of, okay, making sure my peer group, i.e. the CEO's direct reports, are on board with the priorities we set. If there's conflict there, I'll elevate it. And again, conflict is one of those things that conflict builds muscle. Again, if you don't have any conflict, as everybody can tell you, if you don't have conflict, if you don't have resistance, you don't build muscle. The goal is to build that organizational capacity to have these tough decisions and tough discussions. And it needs to be had, because if you're a D&I leader, you need to know your CEO or the person who has the positional authority that you might not is going to support the things you're trying to get done. Otherwise, you're just, I don't want to use an expression that could be misconstrued. Otherwise, you're wasting your time.
Any additional thoughts from other panelists around the question of how to lead when there are competing or conflicting values among executive leadership?
I apologize. I was not on mute earlier and I was thinking out loud. Sorry. So I guess, you know, one of the things that I think about is when I'm working with people, what is the moral imperative and what is the business why? And for me, this work haunts me at night. Like, it is a moral imperative, but for others, it is a business move. And so sometimes, whether I like it or not, I think that explicating the business why might help some people first begin to see why they need to shift their values and things like that. And I just hope that they catch on to, hey, we're really talking about people, not dollars. But if I need to engage you initially talking about dollars and all of that, let me do that, because if you get it that way, you'll do less harm eventually. But the other thing that I would say is that America in the globe is changing. It's becoming more rapidly diverse. It already is. And so the bottom line is, I am thinking that there will be a day soon, I hope, where we come to the conclusion of you cannot hold title of leader without this competency anymore. It's becoming that critical. I would say it already is that critical, but I think slowly and perhaps painfully, people are going to realize that cultural intelligence, cultural competency is a muscle that you must have and be effective, highly effective in if you're going to lead, period. Because we're in America, we see data all over the place that lets us see that people are all over the continuum. So I would tell people, we are in the phase, unfortunately or fortunately, we're casting that wide. This is the time to try to pause and build relationships to build capacity in folks. But there will soon be a time where it's kind of like, okay, the bus is moving. You do need to still build that muscle, but now you're in a different class, doing that on your own because everybody else is moving forward. So the last thing that I'll just say about that, and I've had some painful lessons and some beautiful reminders of relationships are the accelerant to hard things. And so if we can leverage relationships to help us engage this work in those people, let's do it. And at the same time, I am not saying kumbaya. I'm saying that there are some deep-seated issues and conflict that we have to address individually, interpersonally, institutionally, and systemically. Let's do that work. Right now, I think it's about casting the net wide and providing opportunities for people to shift. But there will be a time where the bus leaves. But I don't think you can call yourself a leader in 2022 without this muscle.
Agree. Courtney, do you have anything to add? Nope. All right. So I will keep things rolling. My next question, I'm going to direct at Joe. What suggestions do you have for elevating DEI work out of the committee or working group or volunteer group and integrating it into more professional roles within the organization? So it can be difficult to sustain momentum when you're doing most of the work through volunteer committees. And this question was actually raised at our last workshop where we were talking about planning, but we ran out of time to address the question. So I thought it'd be good to circle back because it is very relevant to leading as well. So Joe, how do you elevate this work beyond a volunteer group or a committee?
So for me, really starts off when Gentex started, we had a DEI committee. And one of the things that as I got the diversity, the DEI committee actually predates me from a diversity officer perspective. And as I came into DEI committee, one of the things I really want to do is capture what the vision was that our CEO had for diversity, equity, inclusion. And then at that point, create kind of what our guiding principles are for DEI committee. And again, Whitney, and when we had a prep session right before the meeting today, I alluded to a book that I used a lot, and I reference it a lot, called The Starfish and the Spider. And for the way I always view things is that if you set the right ideology up, you'll allow people to do DEI work wherever they exist in the organization. So first, we wanted to create what the vision was. What was the vision that Steve Downing had for diversity and inclusion work? For us is 1, being world-class, 2, making a difference, and then 3, being a talent magnet. Those are pretty wide buckets, but it gives kind of the framework for how D&I should be focused on. Then the next thing we did is we create kind of our DEI council parameters. And this is all something that's internally driven by the DEI council, which is cross-functional, cross-leadership level, multiple identities present on the council. And we had 10 council parameters. I could share those with Whitney. She could put those out to the group if you would like to see those. And then that provided the framework. And then at that point, it's trying to establish multiple levels of engagement. Because the way we go about doing DI work at Gentex is you can do D&I work wherever you exist in the organization. And in fact, this is kind of further emphasized again about a year ago. You remember it was like the week of 1,000 blows, at least for me as a Black male in the United States. We had the Christian Cooper, Amy Cooper video that surfaced. You learned about George Floyd. You're still processing what happened to Armor Arbery, at least I was. You heard about what happened with Breonna Taylor. And all those things were something where Steve Downing put up kind of a call to action. And he emphasized the points, okay, you need to make a difference. What is your call to action? Which means making a difference where you exist. And so at that point, it kind of gave the organization license to do DI work wherever it existed. You know, what are you doing personally? What are you doing professionally? Where do those things intersect? And then again, as a DEI counsel, the diversity officer, we as a company kind of prefer those things where our employees are already engaged in because it's a natural vetting process. And so we have people who are involved in escape ministries. There's people who do a lot of different things. I've actually met a lot of community partners that way. But once you go beyond those things, I think what's really critical, and I'll give you an example of how the output of that happened. And that is one of the things we recognize as a barrier to employment for us as a company is the ability to speak English. And I know I talked to our manager of talent acquisition at the time. He said, Joe, I have an idea, you know, there's people we are excluding and working in terms of our hourly employees that we should be able to tap into, because one, it gives them a great opportunity in terms of providing an income for themselves, but also we need that talent as well because we need that diversity of thought inside of our company. Well, there's a group that formed outside of the DEI Council purview, which is fine because it fits into our DEI philosophy, where we have Spanish manufacturing lines now, which for us, being English is usually a requirement to work inside of Gentex is huge for us. We started off on one shift on third shift, and now we have 3 shifts, 5 manufacturing lines, and we have the ability to bring up about 52 people. And this is just generation 1. When I say Rev 1, because I've had people who talk about saying, okay, why are we just targeting Spanish? Why aren't we targeting all languages? Well, that's where you have to start at the pace your organization can digest. We wanted to start with Spanish, but the goal is to expand to other language pools that exist inside of West Michigan, because we have a great immigrant and population center here in West Michigan that we want to be able to allow people that employment base. So again, it starts with your ideology, and then as you identify things that are barriers to entry, because in fact, one of our council parameters is called, we obliterate barriers real or perceived. Because it can be real in the case of English, and it can be the perception as well. And so we have to address both of those areas, because for some people, the perception is reality.
Thank you, Joe. Would any of the other panelists like to share any thoughts around that, how to elevate DEI work beyond volunteer committees?
I was waiting to see if Brandy wanted to share. I can't see her.
No, go ahead.
Thanks. I'll just say that for us, so I don't know that this is directly answering the question, but 2 things came up for me as I considered this question. One is that in my previous organization, and even here, that an army of volunteers is essential to the work. It is so important to have people throughout the business that are supporting, but appreciate that it is also absolutely true that it becomes difficult to sustain that effort when we all have plates overfull. There's ever more things demanding our attention. And so I think when we can, organizationally, create a way to recognize that effort, that's one such way to sustain energy. So we have equity teams, that's our employee resource groups. Those are super important networks to us. And if we can ensure at a minimum that there's visibility and access for the people that support that work as a function of their efforts, that's a really good start. So one such example might be in the earlier example that I offered, where we asked our leadership team to participate. Specifically, we asked them to participate in conversations, leading conversations across the business related to understanding, increasing understanding, sharing vulnerability. They did that in partnership with our equity team leads. And so not only were our equity team leads getting visibility to the business, they were working really closely with their sponsors and our leadership team members to do that. And then beyond that, and this may be easy for me to say, the other thing I will say, as an organization with established and growing diversity, equity, and inclusion function, which I know not everyone can say that, I think the other side of that is once you do have that function, what I've experienced in the business, so there's a lot of people that volunteer in the work then want to move into that work formally, right? Like, I'd like to join your team and of course we want to foster that, but it is so valuable and important too to have deeply passionate employees that are embedded elsewhere in the business. So the person that's super passionate in operations or super passionate in supply management that might want to work in DEI, often I say that'd be amazing. I'd love to have you on the team, but how do we make sure that we help the business to understand it and you to embed the work that's most essential to your function within your work, because you can influence. People expect me to talk about the importance of DEI, but if you talk about it in supply chain, that's gonna carry a different weight. So again, I don't know that I exactly answered the questions, but those two things came up, but hopefully that's helpful to you.
You got a round of applause from Dr. Lovelady.
Thanks.
All right, I do have another question, which was raised in the chat that I want to ask you all. This is a little bit different than what we prepped for, but obviously diversity, equity, inclusion, new challenges arise every day or every month, especially given the current social justice battles that are going on right now, right? So I know I have some CEOs registered for the event, even though they didn't actually attend. They emailed me and said, hey, I need to catch the recap. I have a meeting conflict. So for our leadership, our executive, our CEOs, can you share with them some of the current challenges in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space that they may not be aware of? You know, what are some of the challenges that you all are having, or some of the battles that you may be fighting, or, you know, just some things that you're trying to lead that may look different now than they would have in the past, if that makes sense? What are your current challenges leading D&I or diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I'll try to just give a cut at this question. I think one of the things that I think is important for us as a company, particularly with the variety of school approaches, and again, the majority of our employees are hourly employees who work on the manufacturing floor, is the flexibility when they have children. In particular, children are involved in school and daycare, and how do they cover the shifts. And that's one of the things that I know our CEO is very aware of. But one of the things we're probably going to be leveraging for us as a company is something called problem solving teams. In fact, we just concepted this with one of our DI council members did with our CEO directly. And that's one of the areas we're going to do as a kind of as a pilot area to try to tackle the issues, to get those voices that we might not hear visible. Because again, the DI council, and this is a challenge we have as well, is just making sure we really have the pulse beat of what's happening on our manufacturing floor in terms of our employees. I know there's a previous discussion that happened earlier this morning that Whitney did a phenomenal job as being a facilitator for Inform in terms of having a more inclusive manufacturing presence. And that's something that we're really working to do, is make sure we hear all those voices. Because again, to exclude one voice is exclude all voices in some cases, because we want to make sure however you identify yourself, wherever you work in the organization, your voice deserves to be heard, so we can accommodate that in terms of how we work about going to have a better future for everyone. And so that's one of the areas I know is a challenge for us as a company. Do we have the answer for that yet? No, but we're willing to kind of have that discussion to make sure we become more equitable for all people involved.
Thank you, Joe. Would anyone else like to share your current challenges? You know, things that look different today than they may have a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago when doing this work?
I don't know. What I'm going to say is, I don't know that the work has changed from where I sit, but the level of intensity perhaps has, in terms of how bold the resistance is, and how much the attacks or sabotaging of the work is wrapped up in personal attacks or other under the belt type attacks. So what I would want CEOs to be mindful of going forward is, this is the work. Whether you're talking about packaging a box, or teaching and learning for scholars, or medical treatment, this is the work, DEI. And so what I invite them to think about is, how are the people that are facilitating this work positioned in the organization? In terms of, are they at the decision-making tables where resources are being allocated and decisions are being made that will influence people? If they are there, I think it signals if they are at those decision-making tables or not. Either way, it signals something related to the importance of the work. And it will either deepen how cross-cutting the work is, or it will silo it. And the work has to be braided into everything. The red thread of equity and inclusion is what we talk about, has to be braided into anything and can't be siloed, or it's a matter of asking yourself, why are you really doing this work? So my encouragement is that it moves beyond the window dressing to the transformation of the culture. I think the other thing, and this is how I kind of started in terms of not different, but perhaps more intense, is the CEO, along with the chief diversity officer and whomever, have to not only think about rolling out things, policies without habits is a no-go, or programs without accountability, but they also have to be very mindful and deliberate about what is the plan to address the resistance, that you don't question if it's going to come, you question when it will come. And so that has to be baked into the action plan as well. And my last thing is not only reframing discomfort in terms of ruffling feathers, but it's also understanding DEI efforts are not successful because of perhaps something that was done in the name of DEI, but it is oftentimes not successful because of our willingness to throw the towel in when it gets hard. It is going to be hard. You have to anticipate the hardness of it and provide cover for the folks who are leading your DEI, which should be your whole executive team, including your chief diversity officer. And so the question is, what will be your willingness to stand strong and firm and continue, because this is the work, and not throw in the towel, because people are coming for you and coming for the work. It's not a question of if they're coming, it's a matter of when and how will they show up. So how do you plan for that, CEO? And I think I've already talked about resource allocation. Really quickly, I would say, when you look at the resources allocated for this work and the resources allocated for other work, what does it tell you? Is one living on a skinny Jane type diet and the other a fat filled cow, type? I'm just making up names, but I think you get the point. So that's what I would say.
Perfect.
I want to curse them also, Whitney. This is my last thing for real, the Baptist preacher. I want to curse them with that same, how I talked about equity and inclusion issues haunt me. I hope it also haunts them in the same way, that they know that they can't continue to do the same thing that we've been doing, and definitely can't do the same thing and expect different results. I'll be quiet now.
Don't ever feel like you have to be quiet. It's a privilege to listen and learn from you, Dr. Lovelady. But I do want to invite Courtney to share any responses on this question, if you have any.
I kind of have responses to this, but it kind of weaves into the next question. So if you want to move along, I can come back to this one if that's not too messy.
Okay, so I was actually going to shift to the final.
Were you? Okay, well then I'll make some comments, if that's all right. I'll make some comments and I'll address that a little bit. The question as written was advice to give to a newly appointed D&I leader, and I'm happy to move away from that. But the advice that I would offer to a newly appointed DEI leader and a CEO is to be deeply curious, to listen, to ask questions, to seek to understand the current conditions and the culture and the unique conditions within your organization. I think it's a super huge question to say, tell me, the CEO, everything that you're experiencing that's hard, because it's hard. Like, this is hard work all day. And so I think that certainly there were some really good examples of what is challenging. I agree with what Joe and Dr. Lovelady Mitchell said, but in particular, Dr. Lovelady Mitchell talked about the intensity of the work. Not only is there an intensity of resistance, but for organizations that are committed to or claim to be committed to this, there is a deeper intensity and demand on having a solution, having a silver bullet, and just fixing the problem and making it go away. That is not real life, right? And so I think like my ask of CEOs would be to be deeply curious, to follow publications like I found Race Ahead through Fortune. They have a weekly newsletter, sometimes more often, a really excellent resource for having a finger on the pulse, at least of race discussions and race issues, particularly in a corporate context. Set up Google alerts and have things sent to your email. Reading and paying attention. What's particularly different this year than last year, I think, is that some of us had a new awakening last year that this was important work to do, and now we want to do it. And I heard this on a different panel. I won't do justice to the person that said it, but what they talked about, and Brandy touched on this too, is that comparison between like this function to another one. I'll pick specifically on finance, that your CEO would never come to you and say, I need you to make a financial plan, and you have an unreasonable amount of time to get it done. And oh, by the way, I have a ton of opinions about how you should do it. You would trust your expert. Your financial expert would set that plan. You would trust their strategy. But with diversity and inclusion work, the challenge is that each of us have our own unique experiences with DEI, our own perceptions and experience bias related to identities and the challenges related. So there's a ton of chefs in the kitchen in organizations where, so there's either a ton of resistance, or in organizations where there is interest, there's a lot of people that have opinions and they want you to create a perfect silver bullet plan that doesn't exist with a constrained timeline and fix all the problems. And so for that newly appointed leader, I would also offer that there is an opportunity to think about how the lessons you bring with you and the expertise that you have, and that there's no perfect playbook. Go plug this in and everything will be great. And so don't be in such a hurry to make your mark that you forget to slow down long enough to understand current conditions and adapt your tried and true accordingly for the organization.
That was really impactful and relevant, like you said, to our new D&I leaders and also our CEOs and leaders within companies. So thank you for that, Courtney.